All right, let's dive right into this multidisciplinary explainer, deconstructing the philosophy, neurobiology, and clinical psychology of Rupert Spira's direct path. Now, for the experienced meditators, neuroscientists, and clinicians tuning in, you'll be thrilled to know we are completely skipping the basics today. We are going deep. We're going to map ancient non-dual phenomenology directly onto modern computational neuroscience and clinical psychological frameworks.
Just a quick roadmap of where we're headed. We'll start with the lineage in philosophy, then break down the mechanics of the direct path, look at somatic delocalization practices, the neurobiology of non-dual awareness, clinical psychology and DPDR, and finally, wrap up with some critiques and traditional divergences.
Okay, think about Tirana's absolutely foundational anchor here, the screen in the movie analogy. In his framework, the flat, two-dimensional screen of pure consciousness is never actually obscured by the three-dimensional movie of relative experience. If you're completely sucked into the drama of the movie, sure, you overlook the screen. But once you finally recognize it, the movie doesn't have to stop. That relative reality simply shines as a colorful, vibrant modulation of the absolute.
Moving into Section 1, Lineage and Philosophical Architecture. Let's see how this modern framework is built on a very orthodox foundation. Spira's teaching didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It's a massive, systematic distillation of several profound traditions. He actually spent 20 years deep in classical Advaita Vedanta under Dr. Francis Rolls, studying mantra meditation and heavily intellectual systems. But the real game changer happened in 1997 when he met Francis Lucille. Lucille basically handed Spira two missing puzzle pieces, the hyperlogical direct path teachings of Sri Atmananda Krishna Menon from the 1940s and the deeply somatic tantric approach of Kashmir Shaivism championed by Jean Klein.
Following Atmananda's lineage, Spira logically reduces all objects down to pure consciousness by isolating this fifth sphere, what he calls knowing. Think about it right now in your own immediate experience, without any conceptual overlay. Doing, perceiving, thinking, feeling. They're constantly in flux, right? They're totally transient. The only changeless baseline of your entire subjective experience is the pure knowing of them. That right there is the absolute foundation of radical empiricism in the direct path.
Section 2, Mechanics of the Direct Path. So how do we actually apply this philosophy to transition out of a dualistic mindset?
To guide the intellect through this shift, the direct path uses a rigorous, deconstructive hierarchy, brilliantly mapped out by philosopher Greg Good. First, you bring the universal under the individual. Basically, you realize the external world is only ever experienced as perception. Next, you establish and then stabilize the witnessed, completely isolating your awareness from any objective appearances. And then finally, and this is the absolute kicker, you dissolve into pure consciousness. You completely collapse that boundary between the witness and what's being witnessed.
Which brings us to this incredible quote. Consciousness knows a thing by being that thing. I mean, let that sink in for a second. This is the ultimate epistemological endpoint of those steps. In absolute non-duality, there is zero distance. The subjective experience of knowing an object is literally completely identical to the being of that object. The whole subject-object relationship just evaporates.
Let's jump to Section 3, Somatic Delocalization Practices. Because, as we know, intellectual recognition alone just isn't enough to uproot deep conditioning.
You really have to get into the subconceptual neuromuscular contractions of the body. This is Jean Klein's somatic influence shining through. Consider your conventional awareness. It usually operates through what's called the memory body, which is basically a crystallized pattern of neuromuscular contractions acting as egoic defense mechanisms. It feels heavy, tight, and localized. But when you shift from that projected image into the raw, unconditioned tactile experience, when you just listen to the body's sensations without naming them, you discover this incredibly spacious, boundless, luminous energy.
Section 4, Neurobiology of Non-Dual Awareness. Now, how does this somatic dissolution actually translate into empirical cognitive neuroscience?
This is where it gets incredibly fascinating. Look at the Rebus model. If we treat the brain as an inference machine operating under the free energy principle, the localized I, the ego construct, is essentially the highest, most heavily precision-weighted predictive prior we have. The Rebus model maps the precise neurobiological mechanism of Spira's path. It's the deliberate relaxation of these rigid top-down cognitive priors. And when you relax those, it allows raw, bottom-up sensory information, that boundless tactile energy we just talked about, to flow completely unfiltered.
So when Spira instructs you to beware of being aware, that correlates directly with suppressing the default mode network, the DMN. Neuroimaging shows that when you rest in pure consciousness, there is a massive downregulation of the medial prefrontal cortex and severely reduced functional connectivity in the posterior cingulate cortex. You are quite literally relaxing the brain's predictive prior of a localized, continuous self. You're shifting metabolic energy entirely away from self-referential narrative generation. On to Section 5, Clinical Psychology and DPDR. We have to ask, what happens when this neural deconstruction breaches clinical boundaries? Because dissolving the ego isn't always blissful. Sometimes it's sheer terror.
Interestingly, clinical models like relational frame theory perfectly parallel the direct path. RFT shows how we construct our identity through language and arbitrary relations. In acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, the whole goal is to diffuse a patient from their rigid self as content and shift them towards self as context, which is the observing awareness that just holds all thoughts and feelings. Phenomenologically, that is effectively the exact same witness state Spira points us toward.
But here is the absolute razor-thin boundary between profound spiritual realization and depersonalization derealization disorder, or DPDR. On the surface, they are incredibly similar, a total loss of the localized self. The difference? It lies entirely in cognitive appraisal and the autonomic nervous system. In a contemplative setting, this dissolution is anticipated, it's framed non-dually, and it's met with parasympathetic surrender. But in DPDR, the brain's salience network flags this dissolution as a sudden, massive existential threat, triggering high sympathetic arousal, panic attacks, and obsessive reality checking to try and duct tape the ego back together.
As a clinician, if you have a practitioner who slips from contemplative surrender straight into the threat response of DPDR, you have to pivot immediately from deconstruction to progressive grounding. You have to reactivate the body through sensory motor exercises, tackle those catastrophic thoughts using cognitive diffusion, and use task engagement to literally force a shift of metabolic energy back into the task-positive network. You have to re-anchor the brain in its conventional generative model.
Section 6, Critiques and Traditional Divergences. To be totally comprehensive, we have to look at how this framework is challenged by both orthodox traditionalists and radical contemporaries. From a traditional orthodox lens, critics like Tom Dass argue that Spira's approach actually has some critical omissions. While Spira often cites Ramana Maharshi, his primary practice of passive abidance lacks the really rigorous active tracing of the I thought that orthodox traditions demand. The critique is basically that if you rely too heavily on intellectual deconstruction and sensory welcoming, you risk ending up with a superficial intellectual realization, completely failing to root out the deepest, stickiest sources of the mind.
Now, on the absolute flip side, radical non-duality figures like Tony Parsons critique Spira from the opposite flank. So while traditionalists say Spira doesn't go far enough in his rigorous practice, radical neo-Advaitans assert that doing anything at all is a trap. They reject the reality of the seeker and the path entirely, arguing that any structured effort to awaken is literally just the ego playing another sneaky game of self-improvement.
To wrap up this explainer, as we map this ancient philosophy onto modern neuroscience, we find ourselves staring right at the bleeding edge of contemplative science. If we accept the free energy principle, and we understand that our brain's highest, most precision-weighted predictive prior is the illusion of a separate self, we are left with a profoundly disruptive question. What exactly happens to the future of human neurobiology, and honestly, human evolution itself, when the mind permanently stops predicting I? I'll leave you to contemplate that.